What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most legendary actors found himself facing the role of a lifetime? Not on screen, but in a rain-soaked London evening. When Sir Anthony Hopkins discovered a young boy alone at his theater, clutching a violin case and playing a hauntingly familiar melody, he had no idea this encounter would force him to confront his deepest regrets. The child's mysterious connection to music and a desperate mother's search across the city would unravel a story more compelling than any script he'd ever read. But here's the impossible part. Could helping this lost boy find his way home actually be the key to healing Anthony's own broken relationship with his daughter? What secret lies within the melody that connects them all? And why did fate choose this particular moment to bring them together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What defines a moment of redemption? For Sir Anthony Hopkins, it arrived unexpectedly on a dreary London evening, wrapped in the innocent form of a child who would unknowingly bridge the chasm of his past regrets. The rain-slicked streets of London's West End reflected the theater marquee lights like scattered diamonds, creating an almost ethereal backdrop for what would become a life-altering encounter. Sir Anthony emerged from the stage door of the Royal Court Theatre, his weathered face bearing the subtle traces of exhaustion from his final performance of King Lear. At 86, he still commanded the stage with the same fierce intensity that had defined his illustrious career, though lately, the emptiness that followed each curtain call seemed to echo deeper within his soul. The persistent drizzle forced him to pause beneath the theater's awning, his driver mysteriously absent from the usual pickup spot. The neighboring park, typically bustling with tourists and theater-goers, stood deserted in the growing darkness, save for a solitary figure hunched on a bench. Something about the small silhouette caught Anthony's attention. Perhaps it was the peculiar stillness, too rigid for a casual park-goer seeking shelter from the rain. Drawing closer, he discovered a young boy, no more than 7, perched on the edge of the bench with a violin case clutched protectively to his chest. The child's presence stirred something in Anthony's memory, a fragment of his own past when he volunteered at Mr. Langley's orphanage, teaching drama to children who had lost their way in the world. Those days preceded his rise to fame, before the spotlight began casting longer shadows over his personal life, particularly his relationship with David. The boy looked up, and Anthony noticed his eyes held that same look of lost determination he'd seen countless times at the orphanage. "Are you waiting for someone?" Anthony asked, his rich baritone softened by concern. The boy, who would later introduce himself as Elliot, responded with a slight shake of his head, water droplets cascading from his dark curls. His small fingers remained wrapped around the violin case, knuckles white with tension. The sight stirred an unexpected protective instinct in Anthony, one he thought had long since atrophied through years of emotional distance. Thunder rumbled overhead, causing Elliot to flinch. The boy's reaction prompted Anthony to make a decision that would set in motion a chain of events he couldn't possibly foresee. He extended his hand, umbrella tilted to shield them both from the increasingly heavy downpour. "Perhaps we should find somewhere dry while we sort this out?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities. Elliot's hesitation spoke volumes about the careful teachings of stranger danger, yet something in Anthony's grandfatherly demeanor must have resonated with the child's intuition. After a moment's consideration, he nodded, rising from the bench with the careful movement of someone carrying precious cargo. The violin case, Anthony noticed, bore a name tag with elegant script that read, "Property of Sarah Matthews." As they walked toward the theater's shelter, Anthony found himself studying the boy's profile, noting the subtle trembling of his lower lip that betrayed his brave facade. How many times had he seen that same expression on David's face in the years before their estrangement? The thought sent a familiar pang of regret through his chest, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate concern of the child beside him. Inside the theater's warm lobby, the night security guard recognized Sir Anthony immediately, offering a curious glance at his young companion, but asking no questions. The empty theater took on a different character after hours. Less imposing, more intimate, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this unusual scenario would unfold. Anthony guided Elliot to a plush bench near the box office, maintaining a respectful distance while trying to project an air of trustworthy authority. The boy's violin case contained more than just an instrument. It held a story waiting to be told. As Anthony prepared to unravel the mystery of Elliot's solitary presence in the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than mere coincidence. Perhaps the universe, in its infinite wisdom, had orchestrated this meeting for reasons that would only become clear with time. What neither of them knew was that this rainy evening would mark the beginning of a journey that would touch not only their lives, but also those of everyone connected to them, including a worried mother searching the city streets and an estranged daughter carrying years of unspoken words. Rain pelted against the theater's awning as Sir Anthony Hopkins crouched before the trembling child, his weathered hands carefully draping his wool coat around the boy's shoulders. Elliot's wide eyes, still glistening with tears, darted between Anthony's face and the ground, reminiscent of a frightened sparrow seeking shelter from the storm. "Do you like music, young man?" Anthony's voice carried the warmth of aged whiskey, soft and measured. The question emerged not from mere curiosity, but from decades of understanding how art could bridge the most difficult gaps. Elliot's slight nod encouraged Anthony to continue, his fingers unconsciously tapping a gentle rhythm on his knee. The boy's shoulders remained tense, but his breathing steadied as Anthony hummed the first few notes of Mozart's Piano Concerto. Hour 23. Recognition flickered across Elliot's face, his small fingers beginning to move in sync with the melody. This silent exchange of musical understanding created an unexpected thread between them, weaving through the barrier of fear and uncertainty. Anthony observed how Elliot's posture gradually softened, the universal language of music working its subtle magic. The child's knowledge of classical pieces suggested a cultured upbringing, adding another layer to the mystery of his solitary presence on this rain-soaked evening. Who was this young boy who could recognize Mozart but couldn't find his way home? Memories of Anthony's own daughter, David, at this age surfaced unbidden. How many piano recitals had he missed while pursuing his career? The weight of those absent years pressed against his chest, heavier than the damp London air surrounding them. Yet here was a chance, perhaps, to offer the kind of presence he had failed to provide in his own family. "My mother plays piano," Elliot whispered, breaking the silence. His voice carried the slight tremor of someone testing uncertain waters. The present tense of his words offered Anthony hope. Wherever this child's mother was, she was still very much alive in his world. Anthony's mind raced through the proper protocols for handling a lost child. The responsible action would be to contact the authorities immediately, yet something in Elliot's demeanor suggested that trust needed to be built first. The boy's fingers continued their silent performance on his knee, playing out an invisible concerto that seemed to calm him. "Would you like to tell me about her music?" Anthony asked, settling himself more comfortably on the wet pavement. His aging joints protested, but the importance of maintaining this fragile connection outweighed physical discomfort. The theater's stage door creaked behind them as late-night staff began to emerge, their curious glances adding a sense of urgency to the situation. Elliot's face brightened slightly at the mention of his mother's playing, though anxiety still lingered in the corners of his mouth. "She teaches others," he offered, his voice growing stronger. "But she plays different when it's just for me. Special songs." The rain began to ease, its rhythm shifting from a steady downpour to a gentle patter. Anthony noticed how Elliot's shoulders relaxed further with each shared detail about his mother, each word drawing him out of his protective shell. The boy's musical knowledge could be key to reuniting him with his family, but first they needed to establish a foundation of trust. As more theater staff filtered out into the night, Anthony realized they needed to move somewhere more suitable. The question of how to proceed loomed large. Should he take the child to the police station immediately, or first try to gather more information about his family? The wrong choice could shatter this delicate trust they were building. "I know a place nearby where we might be able to think better," Anthony suggested, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Somewhere warm and dry with people who help children find their way home." His thoughts turned to Mr. Langley's orphanage, where he had volunteered in his younger years. Would the old director still be there after all this time? Elliot clutched the oversized coat tighter around his shoulders, considering Anthony's words. The trust building between them was as fragile as a soap bubble, beautiful, but easily broken by the wrong move or word. How could Anthony maintain this connection while ensuring the child's safety and proper care? The answer lay in their shared understanding of music, a universal language that had already begun to bridge the gap between them. But would it be enough to help Elliot find his way back to his mother, and perhaps help Anthony find his way back to his own child as well? As evening settled over the city streets, the soft glow of street lamps cast long shadows across Anthony's weathered face. The small boy beside him, Elliot, had finally stopped crying, though his quiet sniffles still punctuated the night air. What could possibly comfort a child who had lost his entire world in a single moment of separation from his mother? Anthony reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his phone. Music had always been his refuge during the darkest moments of his life, particularly after the falling out with David. Perhaps it could offer some solace to this lost child as well. But what tune would resonate with a 6-year-old's heart? As he scrolled through his playlist, a particular melody caught his eye: Beethoven's Für Elise. The piece had been a constant companion during his volunteer days at Mr. Langley's orphanage, where he would often hear it drifting from the old piano in the common room. Without hesitation, he pressed play, and the familiar notes filled the space between them. Elliot's head snapped up, his eyes widening with recognition. "That's Mommy's song," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the melody. "She plays it every morning when I wake up." The coincidence struck Anthony like a physical force. What were the odds that this particular piece would connect them? He studied the boy's face, noting how his features had transformed from despair to something approaching hope. "Your mother is a pianist?" he asked gently. Elliot nodded vigorously, his previous tears forgotten. "She teaches piano at the big school with the golden gates. She says music is like magic. It can make sad people happy again." Anthony felt a familiar ache in his chest, remembering how David used to sit beside him at their old piano, her small fingers stumbling over the keys as he guided her hands. How many years had passed since he'd heard her play? The memory of their last argument echoed in his mind, harsh words drowning out the music they once shared. "Your mother sounds very wise," Anthony replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Music does have a special kind of magic. It can build bridges between people even when words fail us." The boy's next words caught him off guard. "Why do you look so sad when you talk about music? Did you lose your magic too?" The innocent question pierced through decades of carefully constructed walls. How could he explain to a child that sometimes the bridges music built could also crumble? That sometimes the very thing that brought people together could become a reminder of what was lost? Before Anthony could formulate a response, a commotion down the street caught their attention. Mr. Langley was approaching, his familiar figure illuminated by the streetlights. The older man's presence brought both relief and apprehension. Relief that help had arrived, and apprehension about confronting his own past through this unexpected reunion. As Mr. Langley drew closer, the music continued to play, weaving together past and present, loss and hope. Could this chance encounter with a lost child and a forgotten melody be more than mere coincidence? Perhaps, Anthony thought, it was time to face the music that had been playing in his heart all these years, the unfinished symphony of his relationship with David. The question remained, would he have the courage to let this unexpected moment of connection guide him toward reconciliation? Or would he, like so many times before, allow the melody to fade into silence? The gentle notes from Anthony's phone faded into silence, but their effect lingered in the air like invisible threads connecting two unlikely souls. Elliot's eyes remained fixed on the device, his small fingers still mimicking the piano movements he'd learned from his mother. For Anthony, watching the child's response to the music stirred something deep within him, memories of another young person he'd failed to understand years ago. What would the authorities do with this lost child at this hour? The question nagged at Anthony as he observed Elliot's delicate features, noting how the boy's shoulders relaxed when the music played. Standard procedure would dictate an immediate call to the police, but something about this situation felt different. Perhaps it was the way Elliot responded to the classical piece. Or maybe it was the ghost of his own parental failures haunting his conscience. Anthony's fingers hovered over his phone's keypad, the emergency numbers waiting to be dialed. But memories of his time at the orphanage with Mr. Langley flooded back. The countless children who needed more than just systematic processing through the social services machinery. Hadn't he learned anything from those years of volunteering? What would Mr. Langley do in this situation? The decision crystallized in his mind as Elliot began humming the melody again, perfectly matching each note from memory. This child wasn't just another lost soul in the city. He was clearly someone's carefully nurtured treasure. The musical education, the refined responses to classical pieces, these weren't coincidental traits. Someone had invested time and love in this boy's development. Anthony's thoughts turned to David, his own daughter. How many times had he chosen protocol over connection? How many moments had he missed because he was too focused on doing things by the book? The weight of those decisions pressed heavily on his shoulders as he watched Elliot continue his silent piano practice on the tabletop. The similarities between music and human connection weren't lost on Anthony. Both required patience, understanding, and sometimes the courage to break from conventional rhythms. His relationship with David had deteriorated because he'd failed to recognize when to deviate from his rigid patterns, when to listen to the emotional undertones rather than just the surface notes. Reaching for his coat, Anthony made a decision that flew in the face of conventional wisdom. He would help this child personally, using his connections and resources to locate the mother while keeping Elliot safe and comfortable. But how would he explain this choice to others? To himself? The risks were considerable, yet the alternative, sending this musically gifted child into the cold machinery of the system, seemed far worse. The boy looked up at Anthony's movement, a question forming in his eyes. "Are you going to help me find my mom?" The simple query carried waves of hope and trust that Anthony hadn't earned but desperately wanted to honor. This wasn't just about finding Elliot's mother anymore. It was about redeeming something in himself that he'd thought was lost forever. Anthony's network of connections in the city was extensive. Surely someone would know of a pianist who had lost her child today. The theater community was tight-knit, and news traveled fast among performers. If Elliot's mother was indeed a professional musician, traces of her panic would already be rippling through those circles. But first, he needed to ensure Elliot's immediate comfort and safety. The boy's eyelids were growing heavy, the emotional toll of the day finally catching up with his young body. Anthony's apartment, though rarely used for entertaining, would have to serve as a temporary sanctuary. How long had it been since children's laughter had echoed through those rooms? Since anyone had needed him for more than his name on a marquee? As he gathered his belongings and gently guided Elliot toward the door, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would alter more than just one night in his life. The simple act of choosing involvement over detachment felt like the first note of a new composition, one that might finally help him understand the melody he'd lost with David years ago. What mysteries would tomorrow bring? How would he balance this self-appointed responsibility with his professional obligations? And somewhere in the city, was Sarah already setting in motion events that would bring their paths together? These questions swirled in Anthony's mind as he led Elliot into the night, each step taking them further from protocol and closer to something that felt surprisingly like redemption. As the evening shadows lengthened across the city streets, Anthony guided Elliot's small hand within his own, their footsteps echoing against the weathered pavement. The decision to help this lost child had awakened something long dormant in Anthony's heart, memories of his own failures as a father intertwining with his present resolve to make things right, if not with his own child, then with this one who needed him now. The familiar path to St. Michael's orphanage brought back a flood of memories from Anthony's volunteer days decades ago. Would Mr. Langley still remember him after all these years? The thought made him pause momentarily, causing Elliot to look up with questioning eyes. The boy hadn't spoken much since their initial encounter, but his grip on Anthony's hand remained steady, trusting. Through the gathering dusk, the Victorian architecture of St. Michael's emerged, its worn brick facade somehow both imposing and welcoming. Anthony noticed how Elliot's steps slowed, the natural hesitation of a child facing yet another unknown. The boy's other hand clutched the small toy piano Anthony had given him, his only comfort in this strange situation. The sound of a piano drifted through an open window, someone practicing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The melody seemed to transform Elliot, his apprehension melting away as his head tilted toward the music. Anthony recognized this piece. It was one Sarah, Elliot's mother, had mentioned during their brief conversation. The connection wasn't lost on him. How music seemed to be the thread binding this child's world together. Mr. Langley's office light still burned bright, a beacon in the growing darkness. As Anthony pressed the ancient doorbell, its harsh buzz cutting through the evening quiet, he wondered how he would explain this situation. What would the old director think of him showing up after all these years, with a lost child in tow? More importantly, how would this decision impact his chance of reuniting Elliot with Sarah? The heavy door creaked open, revealing Mr. Langley, older but still possessing that same keen gaze Anthony remembered from years past. Recognition flickered across the director's face, followed by confusion as his eyes moved to Elliot. The boy shifted closer to Anthony, seeking protection in the shadow of his new guardian. Anthony Hopkins, it's been, 20 years? Mr. Langley's voice carried the weight of decades, yet maintained its characteristic warmth. His eyes never left Elliot, professional concern evident in his expression. And who might this young gentleman be? Before Anthony could respond, a crash echoed from somewhere inside the orphanage, followed by the sound of running feet and children's laughter. The familiar chaos brought an unexpected smile to Anthony's face, memories of his volunteering days flooding back. How many lost souls had found temporary shelter within these walls? How many stories of separation and reunion had these halls witnessed? The situation demanded explanation, but Anthony found himself struggling to find the right words. How could he convey the complexity of the past few hours? The chance encounter with Elliot, the mysterious circumstances of his separation from Sarah, and Anthony's own personal demons that had led him to this moment of decision. Mr. Langley's experienced eyes took in the scene. The protective way Anthony stood near Elliot, the child's obvious trust in this elderly stranger, the toy piano clutched like a lifeline. Years of handling delicate situations had taught him when to wait for explanations and when to act. Without further questioning, he stepped aside, gesturing them into the warmth of the building. As they crossed the threshold, Anthony felt the weight of his decision settle more firmly on his shoulders. This wasn't just about finding temporary shelter anymore. It was about beginning a journey that would either lead to redemption or add another regret to his already substantial collection. The piano music continued to float through the building, its melancholic notes seeming to underscore the gravity of the moment. In the distance, a phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the evening quiet. Could it be Sarah, desperately seeking news of her son? Or perhaps David finally reaching out after years of silence? The possibilities hung in the air, as tangible as the dust motes dancing in the last rays of sunlight streaming through the high windows. Whatever came next would shape not just Elliot's future, but Anthony's as well. The evening shadows stretched across the weathered steps of St. Michael's orphanage as Anthony guided Elliot toward the entrance. The boy's small hand remained firmly clasped in his, a testament to the trust they'd built over their brief encounter. Who could have predicted that a chance meeting would lead them here, to a place Anthony had tried so hard to forget? Mr. Langley's initial stern expression melted into astonishment as he opened the heavy wooden door. The years had etched deeper lines around his eyes, but his penetrating gaze remained unchanged. Anthony? Anthony Hopkins? The name emerged as a whisper, heavy with decades of unspoken history. I never thought I'd see you here again. The recognition stirred something deep within Anthony, Memories he'd carefully locked away, rushing back like a flood, breaking through ancient barriers. Faces of children he'd once read to, played with, and ultimately left behind, flickered through his mind. How many of them had wondered why he'd stopped coming? How many had added his name to their list of abandonments? Elliot sensed the tension, his grip tightening on Anthony's hand. Mr. Langley's attention shifted to the child, professional concern overtaking his surprise. And who might this young gentleman be? His voice carried the warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for lost children. As Anthony explained their situation, carefully omitting his own connection to the orphanage, Mr. Langley's eyes never left his face. The older man's expression suggested he was piecing together a puzzle, comparing the passionate young volunteer he'd known with the guarded celebrity before him. What changes did he see? What questions burned behind his measured responses? Of course, we'll help locate the boy's mother, Mr. Langley assured them, ushering them inside. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old books wrapped around Anthony like a forgotten embrace. But first, let's get you both settled. The children are having dinner now. Perhaps you'd like to join them. The suggestion made Anthony's stomach clench. The dining hall would be filled with children, their faces unconsciously mirroring the ones from his past. Would they see through his carefully constructed facade? Would they recognize the man who once promised to always be there? Only to disappear without explanation, Mr. Langley led them through corridors that seemed both foreign and achingly familiar. The walls, once bare except for a few faded prints, now displayed vibrant artwork, clearly the work of small, enthusiastic hands. Each piece seemed to mock Anthony's desertion, reminding him of the life he'd chosen to leave behind. "You know, Anthony," Mr. Langley spoke softly as they walked, "some of the children you used to read to now bring their own children here to volunteer." The words carried no judgment, yet they struck Anthony like physical blows. "They never forgot your stories, especially the ones you used to make up about the lonely knight who found his way home." Elliot's interest piqued at the mention of stories. "You made up stories?" he asked, looking up at Anthony with renewed curiosity. The innocent question carried the weight of both past and present, bridging decades of carefully maintained distance. The sound of children's laughter filtered through the hallway, growing louder as they approached the dining hall. Anthony found himself walking more slowly, each step requiring conscious effort. How many times had he heard that same sound years ago? How many times had it filled him with joy rather than apprehension? Mr. Langley paused before the dining hall doors, his hand resting on the handle. "You know, Anthony, sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't in the grand gestures but in facing the paths we once abandoned." His words hung in the air between them, an invitation and a challenge wrapped in one. The door handle seemed to pulse with possibility. Beyond it lay not just a room full of children, but a chance to confront the choices that had led him here. Would stepping through that door mean facing more than just his past? Could it possibly offer a way to understand his own failed relationship with David? Elliot tugged gently at his hand, ready to move forward despite not understanding the weight of the moment. His innocent eagerness served as a reminder that sometimes the simplest actions, like helping a lost child, could lead to the most profound opportunities for redemption. The gentle patter of rain against the orphanage windows stirred something deep within Anthony's consciousness as he watched Elliot's small fingers dance across the piano keys. Each note the boy played transported the elderly actor back through the corridors of time, to moments he had carefully locked away in the dusty chambers of his memory. Mr. Langley's earlier recognition had opened floodgates Anthony hadn't realized existed. How many Sunday afternoons had he spent in this very room, playing melodies for children who, like Elliot, found solace in music? The worn wooden bench beneath him felt familiar, almost as if it had been waiting for his return. "All these years. You used to play Chopin's nocturnes," Mr. Langley remarked softly, his voice cutting through Anthony's reverie. The children would gather around, just as they're doing now with young Elliot. Indeed, several orphanage residents had drifted into the room, drawn by the music, creating an eerily similar tableau to those long-ago days. Anthony's hands trembled slightly as he remembered the last time he had performed in this room. It was the day before his career had taken off, before the bright lights of Hollywood had beckoned with their seductive promise of fame and fortune. The same day David, then barely 7, had begged him not to leave for another audition. How different might things have been if he had listened? The memory of David's tears merged with the sound of Elliot's playing, creating an emotional symphony that threatened to overwhelm him. What cruel twist of fate had brought him back here, guiding another lost child through music when he had failed his own so completely? The irony wasn't lost on Anthony. Here he was, trying to help reunite a mother and child, while his own relationship with David lay in shambles. Elliot paused in his playing, looking up at Anthony with questioning eyes. "Can you teach me the song you're humming?" The elderly actor hadn't even realized he'd been humming the lullaby he used to play for David, the same one his own father had taught him, passed down through generations of their family. Mr. Langley settled into a nearby chair, his eyes reflecting, understanding. Music has a way of preserving memories, doesn't it, even the ones we think we've forgotten? He pulled out a weathered photograph from his jacket pocket, a younger Anthony surrounded by children, his hands positioned on these same piano keys. "We kept this, you know. Some of those children never forgot the man who brought music into their Sundays." The photograph trembled in Anthony's hands as he studied it. There, in the corner, stood a small girl with familiar eyes. David. She had insisted on joining the orphanage children during his performances, claiming she didn't want to share her father with anyone unless she could be part of it too. How had he forgotten that detail? As Elliot resumed playing, his small hands finding their way through a simple melody, Anthony found himself wondering about Sarah. Did she play music for her son? Did they share moments at the piano like he once had with David? The thought of another parent-child relationship fractured by circumstance weighed heavily on his heart. Mr. Langley's voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for Anthony's ears. "It's never too late to create new harmonies from old melodies." The words hung in the air, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Was it truly never too late? Could the discord of decades find resolution in these unexpected circumstances? The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, accompanying Elliot's playing. In this moment, past and present merged, creating a symphony of remembrance and possibility. What would it take to bridge the chasm between father and daughter? Perhaps the answer lay not in the grand gestures of apology, but in the simple notes of a shared memory. Anthony closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash over him. In his mind's eye, he could see David as she was then, and Elliot as he was now. Two children separated by decades but connected through the universal language of music. Could this lost boy be the key to finding his way back to his own lost child? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The late afternoon. Sun cast long shadows through the orphanage's dusty windows as Anthony followed the sound of hesitant piano keys. Each note, though tentative, pulled at something deep within his memory. As he approached the music room, he found Elliot perched on the ancient piano bench, his small fingers exploring the yellowed ivory keys with surprising gentleness. The sight transported Anthony back decades to countless evenings spent in this very room, teaching orphaned children the basics of music theory. The old Steinway grand piano, though weathered by time, still maintained its dignified presence. How many young hands had touched those keys over the years? How many souls had found solace in its melodies? Elliot looked up as Anthony entered, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Did you used to play here?" he asked, somehow sensing the connection between the elderly actor and the instrument before him. The question caught Anthony off guard, stirring memories he'd long suppressed of teaching his own daughter David on this very piano. Those Sunday afternoons of shared music had been their special time together, before career demands and misunderstandings had driven them apart. Mr. Langley appeared in the doorway, his expression knowing. "That piano has been here since before either of us, Anthony," he said quietly. "Though I dare say you made it sing more beautifully than most." The orphanage director's words carried the weight of shared history, of countless concerts and impromptu performances that had once filled these halls with life. Elliot's fingers found a simple melody, the opening notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The same song Sarah, his mother, had likely taught him. The same song Anthony had once used to introduce countless children to the joy of music. The same song that had been David's first musical achievement. "Would you teach me?" Elliot's voice was soft but eager, reminiscent of another child from long ago. Anthony found himself moving forward, drawn by forces beyond his control. As he settled beside Elliot on the bench, the familiar smell of wood polish and age it felt brought forth a flood of emotions he hadn't expected to confront. Mr. Langley watched from the doorway as Anthony guided Elliot's small hands across the keys, showing him proper finger placement and timing. The scene mirrored countless others from decades past, yet this particular moment carried its own unique weight. In Elliot's concentrated expression, Anthony saw echoes of his own daughter's determination, of the countless children who had found their voice through music within these walls. The piano's rich tones filled the room as Elliot began to grasp the simple melody, his confidence growing with each successful note. Anthony found himself speaking softly, sharing the same gentle instructions he'd once given to David. How strange that life should bring him full circle, back to this room, back to teaching, back to confronting the ghosts of his past through the innocent questions of a lost child. As the lesson continued, Mr. Langley silently withdrew, leaving teacher and student absorbed in their shared discovery. The afternoon light continued its slow dance across the floor, highlighting the dust motes that swirled with each press of the piano keys. In this moment, the barriers between past and present seemed to blur, creating a bridge across time that connected all the lives touched by this single instrument. What secrets did this old piano hold? How many stories were written in its scratches and worn finish? As Anthony watched Elliot's growing confidence, he couldn't help but wonder if this chance encounter might be more than mere coincidence. Perhaps in teaching this lost child, he might find his own way back to the daughter he'd lost touch with so many years ago. The lesson continued, each note bringing forth new memories while simultaneously creating fresh ones. In this room, where time seemed to stand still, two souls found common ground through the universal language of music. What began as a simple piano lesson was transforming into something far more significant, a chance for healing, for understanding, and perhaps for redemption. The evening shadows crept across the orphanage walls as Anthony sat in a worn armchair, watching Elliot's peaceful slumber. The boy's earlier piano playing had stirred something deep within him, bringing forth memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. How many nights had he spent like this, decades ago, watching over other children who weren't his own, while his own daughter waited at home? The soft moonlight filtering through the window cast a silvery glow on Elliot's face, reminding Anthony of those precious moments when David was young. He would sometimes stand in her doorway, watching her sleep, after returning late from theater rehearsals. Those stolen moments of fatherhood grew increasingly rare as his career flourished, until they ceased altogether. Mr. Langley's footsteps echoed softly in the hallway, pausing briefly at the door. "He reminds you of her, doesn't he?" The old director's voice carried the weight of shared history. Anthony didn't need to answer, they both knew the truth. The parallels between Elliot and young David were uncanny. The same musical inclination, the same thoughtful expression when concentrating. Memories of David's first piano recital surfaced unbidden. She had been about Elliot's age, her small fingers dancing across the keys with determination. Anthony had promised to be there but arrived only for the final notes, having prioritized an audition over his daughter's milestone moment. The disappointment in her eyes that day marked the beginning of their slow drift apart. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in the quiet room. Anthony found himself wondering about Sarah, Elliot's mother, imagining her frantic search across the city. Did she, like him, have regrets about time spent away from her child? Or had she learned from the mistakes of parents like himself, choosing presence over absence, love over ambition? Mr. Langley returned with 2 cups of tea, offering one to Anthony. "You know, she asks about you sometimes," he said, settling into a nearby chair. "David, I mean." She called the orphanage last Christmas, wondering if you still volunteered here. The revelation sent a jolt through Anthony's chest. All these years he'd assumed she wanted nothing to do with him. Elliot stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about music. Anthony adjusted the blanket around the boy's shoulders, his hand lingering for a moment. How different might things have been if he'd shown such tenderness to David more often? If he'd recognized that success meant nothing without family to share it with? The night grew deeper, and with it came the weight of missed opportunities and unspoken words. Anthony pulled out his phone, scrolling to David's number, unchanged for years, though never dialed. Would she answer if he called? What would he say after all this time? The presence of Elliot, lost and seeking his mother, made Anthony acutely aware of the precious bonds between parent and child. Mr. Langley's voice broke through his contemplation. Sometimes, Anthony, life gives us second chances in unexpected ways. He gestured toward Elliot. This boy needs to find his mother, yes, but perhaps he's also here to help you find your way back to your daughter. The truth of those words settled heavily in the room. Tomorrow they would continue their search for Sarah, but tonight, in the quiet of the orphanage, Anthony faced the reality of his own broken relationships. As he watched over Elliot, he began to understand that protecting this lost child might be the first step toward mending his own family's fractured bonds. In the distance, a piano note resonated, perhaps from the wind through the old building, or perhaps from somewhere deeper in memory. It carried with it the promise of reunion, of healing, of the possibility that it wasn't too late to rewrite the ending to his own story. But would David be willing to turn the page with him? The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Mr. Langley's office as Anthony explained his theory about Elliot's connection to music. The familiar melody the boy had hummed seemed like more than just a coincidence. It could be the key to finding his family. Mr. Langley listened intently, his weathered hands folded on the desk between them. There's a music store downtown, Anthony said, his voice carrying the weight of possibility. The one on Baker Street that's been there for decades. If Elliot's mother is indeed a pianist, she might have connections there. The theory wasn't much, but it was the only lead they had. Mr. Langley nodded thoughtfully, his eyes drifting to where Elliot sat in the corner, absently flipping through a picture book. And you'll accompany him yourself? The question carried undertones of concern, knowing Anthony's complicated history with children. Anthony watched as Elliot turned another page, remembering how his own daughter David used to sit in similar corners, lost in her own world of stories. Yes, he replied, his voice softer than intended. I believe I need to do this. The journey to Baker Street was filled with Elliot's constant humming, the melody now permanently etched in Anthony's mind. The boy's small hand felt warm in his as they navigated the busy sidewalks, dodging morning commuters and street vendors. Anthony found himself unconsciously matching his pace to Elliot's shorter steps. A long-forgotten paternal instinct resurfaces after decades of dormancy. The bell above the music store's door chimed as they entered, releasing a wave of nostalgia through the air. Sheet music lined the walls and various instruments stood proudly on display. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, looked up from behind the counter, her reading glasses perched precariously on her nose. Can I help you? She asked, her eyes moving curiously between Anthony and Elliot. Anthony guided Elliot forward, his hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. We're trying to trace a melody, he explained, then turned to Elliot. Would you hum it for the nice lady? Elliot, suddenly shy, pressed closer to Anthony's side. The familiar gesture reminded Anthony painfully of David, how she used to seek his protection before their relationship crumbled under the weight of his career choices and absent parenting. Mrs. Chen came around the counter, kneeling to Elliot's, level with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime working with young musicians. It's all right, dear. Music is a language we all share. Encouraged by her gentle approach, Elliot began to hum the melody that had become their only clue. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from polite interest to recognition, her eyes widening slightly. That's from Moonlight Sonata in Winter, she said, straightening up. It's an original piece composed by Sarah Bennett. She performs at the Grand Theatre on weekends. She paused, studying Elliot more closely. Come to think of it, you look quite a bit like her. Anthony's heart rate quickened. Sarah Bennett. Could this be Elliot's mother? The name wasn't uncommon, but combined with the musical connection and the physical resemblance Mrs. Chen had noticed, it felt too significant to be coincidental. Mrs. Chen moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a concert program. She's actually performing tonight, a special performance of her original compositions. She handed the glossy paper to Anthony, who studied the photograph of a woman seated at a grand piano, her expression serene and focused. Elliot pressed against his side, standing on tiptoes to see the program. His small finger pointed to the photograph, and for the first time since Anthony had found him, words tumbled from his mouth. Mama plays pretty music. The confirmation sent a wave of emotions through Anthony, relief at finally having a solid lead, anxiety about the impending reunion, and an unexpected twinge of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye to Elliot. He had spent less than 24 hours with the boy, yet somehow their brief connection had begun to heal wounds he'd carried for decades. Mrs. Chen was already reaching for the phone. I can call the theater. Let them know you're coming. Sarah's been beside herself since her son went missing. It's been all over the local news. As she dialed, Anthony looked down at Elliot, who had begun humming his mother's melody again. How many times had he wished for a second chance with David? Perhaps helping Elliot find his way back to his mother could be the first step toward finding his own way back to his daughter. The question now was, would the evening's performance bring more than one family back together? The quaint music store's bell chimed as Anthony and Elliot stepped inside, the familiar scent of aged paper and wood filling their nostrils. Elliot's small hand remained firmly clasped in Anthony's as they navigated through towering shelves of sheet music and worn songbooks. The boy's eyes darted around, recognition flickering across his features at the sight of musical instruments lining the walls. An elderly shopkeeper, her silver hair neatly pinned back, looked up from her counter with mild curiosity. Can I help you gentlemen? Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had spent decades surrounded by music. Anthony explained their mission, describing the melody that had become their shared obsession. As he hummed the first few notes, Elliot joined, and their voices creating an impromptu duet that echoed through the store. The shopkeeper's eyes widened with recognition. That's from Sarah Matthews's latest composition, she said, moving toward a display near the window. She's quite well known in the local classical circuit, performs at the Symphony Hall every other weekend. She pulled out a pristine program, featuring a woman with warm eyes and honey-colored hair seated at a grand piano. Elliot's reaction was immediate and profound. His small body tensed, and tears welled up in his eyes as he pointed at the photograph. Mama, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. The revelation struck Anthony like a physical blow. The mysterious melody that had drawn them together was composed by Elliot's mother. The shopkeeper's expression shifted from helpful to concerned as she studied Elliot more carefully. Wait a minute. Isn't this the child from the news, the one who went missing during the festival? She reached for her phone, but Anthony raised his hand reassuringly. We're heading to the police station right now, he explained, his actor's training, helping him maintain composure despite his racing heart. Could you tell us more about Sarah Matthews' performances? The information could prove crucial in their search for Elliot's mother. As the shopkeeper shared details about Sarah's regular venues and upcoming performances, Anthony's mind wandered to his own daughter, David. How many times had she reached out for him, only to find him absent, buried in scripts and performances? The parallel between Sarah's desperate search for Elliot and his own fractured relationship with David created an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. Elliot tugged at Anthony's sleeve, drawing his attention to a stack of sheet music. The boy's fingers traced the notes of his mother's composition, following the familiar pattern they'd both been humming. The shopkeeper explained that Sarah had written the piece shortly after Elliot's birth, titled My Little Light. The melody was a mother's love transformed into music, a lullaby that had unconsciously stayed with Elliot even during their separation. Anthony purchased a copy of the sheet music, carefully folding it into his pocket. The paper felt like a map, leading them closer to Sarah, but it also represented something more. A reminder of the profound connections between parents and children, connections that could persist even through separation and silence. The shopkeeper provided them with the address of the symphony hall where Sarah frequently performed. "She has a rehearsal scheduled for this afternoon," she added, her voice tinged with hope. "If you hurry, you might catch her there." As they prepared to leave, Anthony noticed Elliot studying his reflection in a brass trumpet hanging on the wall. The boy's expression carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension, the same emotions Anthony felt about potentially reuniting Elliot with his mother. Would this discovery lead them to Sarah? And if it did, what would become of the unexpected bond they'd formed? The melody that had initially brought them together now served as a bridge to Elliot's past and, hopefully, his future with his mother. Yet, for Anthony, it also sparked questions about his own future. Could the simple act of helping this lost child find his way home somehow illuminate the path to reconciliation with David? As they stepped back onto the street, the sheet music, secure in Anthony's pocket and Elliot's hand warm in his, the familiar notes of My Little Light seemed to float around them, carrying promises of reunion, redemption, and the possibility of healing long-broken bonds. The symphony hall awaited, and with it perhaps the answers they both sought. The melody that had brought Anthony and Elliot together now echoed through the city's streets in an entirely different way. Sarah's desperate voice called out her son's name as she distributed flyers bearing Elliot's photograph across downtown, her fingers trembling each time she released a paper into another stranger's hands. What she couldn't know was that at that very moment, her son sat at Anthony's grand piano, playing the same lullaby she had taught him years ago. Miles away, Anthony watched Elliot's small fingers dance across the keys with growing concern. The boy's connection to the mysterious pianist from the newspaper article couldn't be coincidental, yet he hesitated to act on his suspicion. Would revealing what he knew too soon somehow shatter this delicate bond they'd formed? The weight of his own past mistakes with David pressed heavily on his conscience, making each decision feel monumental. Mr. Langley's involvement added another layer of complexity to the situation. His daily calls to Anthony carried increasing urgency as reports of Sarah's search made local headlines. "The mother's story is all over the news now," he explained during their latest conversation. "She's a concert pianist who lost her son during her performance at Memorial Hall." The pieces were falling into pieces, but the picture they formed left Anthony with a moral dilemma he hadn't faced in decades. The investigation took an unexpected turn when David, Anthony's estranged daughter, became inadvertently involved. As a local journalist, she had been assigned to cover the story of the missing child. Without knowing her father's connection to the case, she followed leads that would eventually bring her face to face with the past she'd tried so hard to leave behind. How would she react upon discovering that the subject of her article was currently under her father's care? Sarah's search pattern grew more frantic with each passing day. She retraced her steps through the concert hall countless times, hoping to uncover some overlooked clue. The security footage had proven unhelpful, showing only Elliot's small figure disappearing into a crowd during intermission. The boy's fascination with music had led him to wander, but where had that wandering taken him? The police investigation continued in parallel, though their resources were spreading thin. Detective Morris, assigned to the case, found himself drawn to the peculiar circumstances. A child who vanished during a concert, only to be reportedly seen near various musical venues throughout the city. It painted a pattern that seemed almost orchestrated. But by whom, and to what end? Anthony's reputation in the entertainment industry had kept the media at bay, but he knew this shield wouldn't last forever. Each morning brought new challenges as he attempted to maintain normalcy for Elliot, while grappling with the knowledge that every moment of delay caused Sarah more anguish. The boy's nighttime piano sessions became both a blessing and a curse, beautiful moments that simultaneously highlighted the urgency of reuniting mother and child. The situation grew more complicated when Elliot began asking questions about his own mother with increasing frequency. "Why hasn't she found me yet? he would ask, his young voice carrying notes of worry that no child should have to express. Anthony's answers became more difficult to formulate, each response feeling inadequate against the pure simplicity of a child's concern. Mr. Langley's experience with similar cases provided little comfort. Sometimes, he told Anthony during one of their late-night calls, the right path isn't the easiest one. His words carried the weight of years spent watching families torn apart and brought together again. But this situation felt different. It wasn't just about reuniting a mother and child anymore. It had become about healing wounds that stretched across generations. The melody that Elliot played each day grew stronger, more confident, as if he were sending a musical signal into the world. Unknown to him, Sarah had begun playing the same lullaby during her daily searches, creating a haunting echo through the city's streets. Mother and son, separated by circumstance but connected through music, were drawing closer together with each passing moment. Would Anthony recognize this symphony of separation before it reached its final note? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah's Victorian townhouse as Anthony and Mr. Langley stood before the weathered front door. Their knocks echoed unanswered through the building, each hollow sound amplifying their growing concern. Elliot, who had been unusually quiet during the drive, clutched Anthony's hand tighter. "Perhaps we should have called ahead," Mr. Langley muttered, peering through the decorative glass panels. The interior remained dark, save for a single lamp, visible in what appeared to be the living room. Through the window they could make out a grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the fading daylight. Anthony's attention shifted to a neighbor watering her plants, who had been watching them with increasing interest. "Excuse me," he called, out, his actor's voice carrying clearly across the small garden. "We're looking for Sarah. Would you happen to know where she might be?" The elderly woman set down her watering can, her face etched with concern. "Poor dear's been at the police station since morning. Completely beside herself she is. Her little boy's gone missing." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she noticed Elliot. "Why, isn't that—" Before she could finish, Mr. Langley stepped forward, smoothly intercepting the conversation. "Thank you for your help. We'll head there straight away." He guided Anthony and Elliot back toward the car, aware that drawing attention to their situation might complicate matters. Inside the vehicle, Elliot's small voice broke the tension. "Mummy's piano," he said, looking back at the house. "She plays it every morning." His words carried a weight that touched something deep within Anthony, stirring memories of his own daughter David's childhood piano lessons, of mornings filled with scales and simple melodies that he had taken for granted. Mr. Langley navigated the evening traffic with practiced ease, while Anthony found himself lost in thought. How many moments had he missed with David? How many morning routines and daily rituals had he sacrificed in pursuit of his career? The parallels between Sarah's desperate search for Elliot and his own emotional distance from David seemed to mock him. "Sir?" Elliot's voice pulled Anthony from his reverie. "Will Mummy be crying?" The question hung in the air, heavy with childhood wisdom and worry. Anthony caught Mr. Langley's knowing glance in the rearview mirror. "Your mother loves you very much," Anthony replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a seasoned performer. "Sometimes when we love someone deeply, we cry because we miss them." He left unspoken his own experience with tears shed too late, after bridges had already burned. The police station loomed ahead, its brutalist architecture a stark contrast to the warm Victorian homes they'd left behind. As Mr. Langley searched for parking, Anthony noticed Elliot's grip tightening once again. The boy's eyes were fixed on the building, his small face a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "I remember when you used to visit the orphanage," Mr. Langley said suddenly, his voice gentle. "You had such a way with the children, Anthony. Always knew exactly what to say to ease their fears." The observation carried an unspoken question about Anthony's own relationship with David. Before Anthony could respond, a figure burst through the police station doors. Sarah's distinctive red coat caught the last rays of sunlight as she paced the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, her distress was palpable, her free hand gesturing emphatically as she spoke. Elliot pressed his face against the car window, his breath fogging the glass. "Mummy," he whispered, and in that single word lay all the complexity of love, loss, and reunion. Anthony felt the weight of his own paternal failures pressing down on him. How different might things be if he had shown the same dedication to David that Sarah showed to Elliot? The moment hung suspended like the last note of a piano piece, waiting for resolution. In the gathering dusk, Anthony realized that this reunion might offer more than just a child returning to his mother. Perhaps it could also illuminate a path toward his own redemption, a chance to understand what it truly means to be a father. As they prepared to exit the car, Mr. Langley turned to Anthony with a knowing look. "Sometimes, Anthony, life gives us second chances in the most unexpected ways." The words seemed to echo in the small space, carrying with them the weight of years of witnessed reunions and restored relationships at the orphanage. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Anthony and Elliot sat in Sarah's modestly furnished living room, where family photographs adorned every available surface. Each frame told a story of happier times, Elliot's first steps, birthday celebrations, and countless moments of mother and son sharing their love of music. The piano in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light, stood as a silent witness to their shared passion. Anthony watched as Elliot gravitated toward the instrument, his small fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. The boy's restraint spoke volumes about his upbringing, even in his mother's absence. He remembered her rules about playing the piano only when permitted. How different this child was from Anthony's own daughter, David, who had rebelled against every boundary he'd tried to set. The weight of missed opportunities pressed heavily on Anthony's shoulders as he observed Elliot's careful movements around his mother's home. When was the last time he'd seen David's childhood photos? Had he ever taken the time to create such loving displays of her growth, her achievements? The walls of his own mansion, adorned with awards and movie posters, suddenly seemed hollow in comparison to this shrine of maternal devotion. Elliot's voice broke through Anthony's reverie. "Can we call Mummy again?" The question, asked for the third time in the past hour, carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. The boy's earlier bravado was beginning to crack, revealing the frightened child beneath. Anthony reached for his phone, knowing the call would go straight to voicemail as it had before, but understanding the comfort the attempt might bring. Expected, Sarah's recorded voice greeted them, professional and warm. Anthony watched Elliot's face fall slightly before the child squared his shoulders, a gesture so reminiscent of David at that age that it made his heart ache. How many times had his daughter put on a brave face when he'd missed her school plays, her piano recitals, choosing instead to pursue his acting career? The parallels between past and present were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Here was another child, another pianist, another opportunity to make different choices. But was it too late for Anthony to learn from his mistakes? Mr. Langley's words from the orphanage echoed in his mind, reminding him of the young man who had once volunteered there, full of idealism and promise, before fame had redirected his priorities. A sudden knock at the door startled them both. Elliot's eyes widened with hope, but Anthony gestured for him to stay seated as he approached the entrance cautiously. Through the peephole, he could see two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious and professional. What news did they bring? Had they found Sarah? Or were they here to question Elliot further, perhaps even to remove him from Anthony's temporary care? The decision to open that door would set in motion events that could either heal old wounds or create new ones. As Anthony's hand reached for the handle, he couldn't help but wonder if this moment would offer him redemption, or merely remind him of all he had lost. Would helping Elliot find his way back to Sarah somehow illuminate the path back to his own daughter? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. Time was moving forward regardless of their waiting game, and with each passing moment the stakes grew higher. For Elliot, for Sarah, for Anthony himself, and perhaps most importantly, for the possibility of mending what had been broken so many years ago. What lay behind that door could change everything. But then again, hadn't everything already changed the moment Anthony had found a lost boy playing piano in an empty theater? Sometimes the most significant transformations begin in the quietest moments, in the spaces between notes, in the pauses between breaths, in the waiting. The setting sun cast long shadows through Sarah's living room windows as Anthony stood before a wall of family photographs, each image a testament to the life he'd disrupted by bringing Elliot here. His weathered fingers traced the edge of a frame showing Sarah and Elliot at what appeared to be a summer beach concert, their matching smiles radiating joy. Behind him, Elliot's soft breathing from the couch where he'd fallen asleep provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the tumultuous thoughts racing through Anthony's mind. How many similar moments had he missed with David? The question emerged unbidden, forcing him to confront decades of regret. His pursuit of acting had seemed so crucial then, each role more important than the last, until the spaces between visits stretched from weeks to months to years. The realization that he'd prioritized fictional characters over his own flesh and blood struck him with renewed force. A small whimper from Elliot drew Anthony's attention. The boy had curled himself into a tight ball, clutching a throw pillow that bore Sarah's faint perfume. The sight triggered memories of the few times he'd watched David sleep, back when she was young enough to still want her father's presence. He remembered how she would grip her stuffed elephant, its ear worn thin from constant handling. Much like Elliot now clung to this piece of his mother's world. Anthony's phone felt heavy in his pocket, David's number stored, but unused for so many years. Each time he'd considered calling, pride and shame had formed an impenetrable barrier. What right did he have to disrupt her life now, after missing so many crucial moments? Yet watching Elliot's innocent trust in him, despite their brief acquaintance, forced Anthony to confront his own cowardice. The parallels between Sarah's separation from Elliot and his own voluntary distance from David created an uncomfortable resonance. Sarah was desperately searching for her child, while he had willingly walked away from his. The weight of this realization pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. How had he convinced himself that his absence was somehow acceptable? Mr. Langley's words from their earlier conversation echoed in his thoughts. Children are remarkably resilient, Anthony, but they never forget. The orphanage director had witnessed countless family separations, yet Anthony had dismissed his wisdom decades ago. Now standing in another parent's home, watching another child's temporary displacement, the truth of those words cut deep. His fingers moved unconsciously to his phone, pulling up David's contact information. The last message he'd sent her, years ago, remained unanswered. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Such an inadequate attempt at connection, yet it had been all he could muster at the time. Now, surrounded by evidence of Sarah's devoted parenting, his own failures seemed monumentally worse. Anthony's gaze fell on a photograph of Elliot at a piano recital, his small hands poised above the keys, Sarah beaming proudly in the background. Music had been David's passion too. She'd played violin with such promise. Had she continued? Did she perform professionally now? These basic facts about his daughter's life remained mysteries of his own making. The sound of a car passing outside caused Anthony to tense, hoping it might be Sarah returning. But the vehicle continued past, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the sleeping child who had unknowingly forced him to confront his deepest regrets. What would Sarah do upon finding Elliot here? Would she understand his intentions? Or would she see him as he increasingly saw himself, someone who had made a terrible mistake? His reflection in the window glass showed a man aged not just by years, but by the weight of his choices. The acclaimed actor, the celebrated Sir Anthony Hopkins, stood revealed as what he truly was, a father who had failed in the most fundamental duty of parenthood. The question that had haunted him for years now demanded an answer. Was it too late to make amends? The gentle tick of a wall clock marked the passing moments as Anthony wrestled with his conscience. Each second brought Sarah closer to discovering their presence here, while simultaneously pushing him toward a decision about his own parental responsibilities. Could helping reunite this mother and child somehow begin to address his own paternal failures? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the orphanage windows as Anthony sat with Elliot at the piano, their fingers dancing across the keys in a simple duet. The melody, A children's song Elliot had learned from his mother filled the quiet halls with warmth that belied the tension building in Anthony's chest. How many more moments like this remained before their inevitable separation? A commotion at the entrance drew Mr. Langley from his office, his footsteps echoing against the wooden floors. Anthony's hands stilled on the keys, and Elliot continued, playing, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. Through the doorway, Sarah appeared, her face bearing the marks of exhaustion and relief that only a searching mother could wear. "Elliot?" Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The music stopped abruptly as Elliot's head snapped up, his small frame freezing for just a moment, before recognition dawned. "Mommy!" He scrambled from the piano bench, nearly tripping in his haste, to reach her. Anthony remained seated, his hands now folded in his lap, watching as mother and child collided in an embrace that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. Sarah's tears fell freely as she held her son, murmuring words of love and relief into his hair. Mr. Langley stood nearby, his usual professional demeanor softened by the scene before him. The reunion stirred something deep within Anthony, memories of his own daughter at that age, of moments forever lost to time and pride. Had David ever looked for him with such desperate joy? Had she waited for his return after he chose his career over their relationship? Sarah finally looked up, her eyes meeting Anthony's with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "You've been caring for my son?" Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 questions. Anthony rose slowly from the piano bench, feeling every one of his 86 years. "He's quite the musician," he offered, attempting to deflect attention from his own. "Earl, like his mother, I understand." Mr. Langley stepped forward, filling the awkward space with necessary explanations about how Elliot had arrived at the orphanage, how Anthony had recognized his musical talent, and the care they'd provided. But Anthony's focus remained on the boy, who now stood in the circle of his mother's arms, looking back at the piano with a hint of reluctance. "Would you play for me, darling?" Sarah asked, sensing her son's unspoken desire. "Show me what you've learned?" Elliot's face brightened, and he tugged his mother toward the piano. Anthony moved to step away, but the boy's voice stopped him. "Can we play the duet? Please, I want Mommy to hear." The request hung in the air, heavy with implications. Anthony glanced at Sarah, seeking permission, and found her nodding encouragement. As they settled at the piano, Elliot between them, Anthony couldn't help but wonder if David had kept up with her music after he left. Did she still play the violin he'd given her for her 10th birthday? The duet began. Elliot's small hands, moving with surprising confidence across his portion of the keys. Anthony followed his lead, adding depth to the simple melody, while Sarah watched, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. The music spoke what words couldn't, of connection, of loss, of healing. When the final notes faded, Sarah wrapped her arms around her son again. "That was beautiful, sweetheart." She turned to Anthony, her expression serious. "Thank you, Mr. Hopkins, for everything." The formality of her address reminded Anthony of his position, a temporary guardian, nothing more. Yet as he watched Elliot gather his few belongings, chattering excitedly about his adventures, Anthony felt the weight of impending solitude settling back onto his shoulders. Mr. Langley approached with paperwork requiring Sarah's signature, leading her to his office while Elliot continued to pack. The boy paused by the piano, his small hand resting on the polished wood. "Will you still be here? If we come back to visit?" The question caught Anthony off guard, piercing through his carefully maintained professional distance. Before he could respond, Sarah returned, papers in hand, ready to reclaim her son and return to their life. But as they prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Perhaps," she said, looking between Anthony and her son, "we could arrange some piano lessons, if you're interested, Mr. Hopkins." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, not just for Elliot's musical education, but for something more profound. Could the simple act of teaching a child to play become a path toward his own redemption? And would David, if she knew, understand this attempt to make amends through another child's music? In the warmth of the living room, as the evening settled into a gentle quiet, Sarah's fingers traced the edges of an old photograph album. Elliot nestled against her side, his small frame still occasionally trembling from the intensity of their reunion. Sir Anthony Hopkins sat across from them, his weathered hands folded in his lap, waiting with patient curiosity as Sarah gathered her thoughts. "The melody Elliot plays," Sarah began, her voice soft with memory. "It wasn't just any lullaby. James, Elliot's father, composed it the day we learned we were expecting." Her eyes grew distant, remembering a time when music filled every corner of their lives. James had been first chair violinist with the London Symphony Orchestra, his talent matched only by his passionate dedication to teaching young musicians. The story unfolded like the notes of a forgotten song. James had written the melody during a late-night session at their small apartment, the excitement of impending fatherhood keeping him awake. He'd worked through the night, crafting each phrase to represent the flutter of a baby's heartbeat, the gentle sway of a mother's arms, the promise of unconditional love. Anthony listened intently, his own memories of fatherhood stirring uncomfortably. How many moments had he missed with David, too consumed by his career to notice the small symphonies of daily life? The thought pricked at his conscience, but he remained focused on Sarah's words. "James would play it every night during my pregnancy," Sarah continued, running her fingers through Elliot's hair. "He said the baby needed to know his father's voice through music first." A smile touched her lips, though her eyes glistened. "When Elliot was born, it became our nightly ritual. James would play, I would sing, and Elliot would drift off to sleep surrounded by love." The accident had come without warning, as such tragedies often do. A rainy night, a slick road, a moment's distraction. James had been returning from a late rehearsal, his violin secure in its case beside him. The melody he'd created for his son became his final composition, though he never knew it would be Elliot's strongest connection to him. "Elliot was only 3, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he never forgot the melody. He started picking it out on the piano by ear, note by note, just a few months after we lost James. It became his way of keeping his father close." Anthony felt the weight of this revelation settle in his chest. The simple tune he'd heard Elliot play held layers of meaning he couldn't have imagined. It wasn't just music. It was memory, love, and loss, woven together in an invisible thread that connected father and son across the boundary of time. Elliot stirred against his mother's side, his small voice adding to the story. "Daddy said music is like magic," he offered. "It can make you feel things even when you can't see them." The profound simplicity of the child's words struck Anthony deeply. How many times had he witnessed the transformative power of art in his own career? Yet here was a reminder of its purest purpose: to connect, to heal, to remember. Sarah reached for her son's hand, squeezing it gently. "James would be so proud of how you've kept his music alive, sweetheart. Every time you play it, you're sharing a piece of him with the world." The revelation of the melody's origin added new depth to Anthony's understanding of Elliot's attachment to it. What had seemed like a child's simple piano exercise was actually a son's way of holding on to his father's love. The parallel to his own situation with David became impossible to ignore. Wasn't every parent-child relationship built on such invisible melodies of connection, even when the notes seemed discordant or lost? As the evening deepened, Anthony found himself wondering about the music in his own life. The unplayed songs, the unspoken words, the moments of connection he'd let slip away. Could there still be time to compose a new melody with David? Or had too many measures passed in silence? The story of James's lullaby hung in the air like the final notes of a beloved symphony, reminding all present that love, like music, never truly dies. It simply waits to be played again, remembered, and shared with those who need it most. Evening shadows stretched across Anthony's living room as the last notes of Sarah's story about Elliot's father lingered in the air. The revelation of the melody's origins had stirred something deep within Anthony, bringing forth memories he'd long tried to suppress. How many times had he sat at his own piano, playing fragments of lullabies he once sang to David? Elliot, displaying wisdom beyond his years, watched Anthony's fingers trace invisible patterns on the piano keys. "Why do you look sad when you play? Certain songs?" The boy's innocent question pierced through Anthony's carefully constructed walls, the same walls that had kept David at bay for decades. "Music has a way of bringing back memories, dear boy," Anthony replied, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken regrets. "Sometimes those memories remind us of people we've lost along the way, not through death but through choices we've made." Sarah, recognizing the delicate moment unfolding before her, quietly excused herself to make tea in the kitchen, leaving the unlikely pair to their conversation. Elliot scooted closer to Anthony on the piano bench, his small shoulder pressing against the older man's arm. "Is that why you don't talk to your daughter?" The question, delivered with childlike directness, caught Anthony off guard. Had he mentioned David to the boy? Perhaps Mr. Langley had said something during their visit to the orphanage. Anthony's hands stilled on the keys. "How did you know about my daughter?" "I saw her picture in your study," Elliot replied, pointing toward the hallway. "She looks like you when you smile, but the picture is very old. Why don't you have new ones?" The observation struck Anthony with unexpected force. The photograph Elliot referred to was taken at David's university graduation, the last time they'd been truly happy together. Before the arguments about his constant absences, before the missed birthdays and broken promises, before she stopped answering his calls altogether. "Sometimes, Elliot, grown-ups make mistakes that seem too big to fix," Anthony explained, struggling to simplify decades of complexity for a child's understanding. "We let pride and stubbornness build walls that become harder to tear down with each passing year." Elliot's face scrunched in concentration. "But you helped find my mom when I was lost. Maybe your daughter is just lost too. Not like I was, but lost in her heart." The profound simplicity of Elliot's logic left Anthony speechless. How had he never seen it this way? All these years he'd viewed their estrangement as an insurmountable fortress, when perhaps it was more like a maze, complicated and confusing, but not without an exit. "My mom always says that love is like music," Elliot continued, pressing random keys gently. "It doesn't go away just because you stop playing it. It stays inside, waiting for someone to press the right keys again." Sarah returned with tea, catching the tail end of Elliot's words. She set the cups down, her eyes meeting Anthony's with understanding. "Children often see things more clearly than we do," she offered softly. "They haven't learned to overcomplicate matters of the heart." Anthony felt a familiar burning behind his eyes. When had he last allowed himself to feel this vulnerable? The walls he'd built around his heart had protected him from pain, but they'd also imprisoned his capacity to heal, to reach out, to try again. "What if she doesn't want to hear from me?" Anthony voiced his deepest fear, surprised to find himself seeking counsel from a 6-year-old and a woman he'd known for mere days. Elliot's response was immediate and unwavering. "But what if she does? What if she's waiting for you to play her song again?" The metaphor wasn't lost on Anthony. How many times had he sat at this very piano, playing the lullaby he'd composed for David when she was born? The same lullaby he'd played on countless nights when she couldn't sleep, the one she'd asked him to perform at her graduation recital, the last time they'd made music together. "Perhaps," Anthony said slowly, "it's time to dust off some old sheet music." The words carried more meaning than their literal interpretation, and both Sarah and Elliot seemed to understand. The boy beamed, while Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Would you help me practice?" Anthony asked Elliot, managing a small smile. "I might be a bit rusty with this particular piece." As Elliot eagerly nodded, Anthony realized that sometimes the push forward we need comes from the most unexpected sources. Who would have thought that a lost little boy would help him find his way back to his own child? The antique phone on Anthony's desk seemed to mock him, its brass finish reflecting the late afternoon sun that streamed through his study window. For decades he had allowed pride and stubbornness to build an insurmountable wall between himself and David. But Elliot's innocent wisdom had begun to chip away at those carefully constructed defenses. Why don't grown-ups just say sorry when they make mistakes? Elliot's words from earlier that morning echoed in Anthony's mind, Cutting through years of rationalization and self-justification, the boy's simple question carried the weight of truth that Anthony had long chosen to ignore. How many times had he rehearsed this moment in his head, only to find another excuse to postpone it? His fingers traced the worn edges of an old photograph. Hidden in his desk drawer, David at her piano recital, age 12, her smile radiating pure joy. The memory of that day brought a sharp pain to his chest. He had missed so many recitals after that one, always citing important rehearsals or performances. What would David think if she knew that her own father now spent his evenings playing piano with a lost child? The irony wasn't lost on Anthony. Here he was, providing comfort and guidance to Elliot while his own daughter remained estranged. Mr. Langley's words from their recent conversation resurfaced. "Time doesn't heal wounds, Anthony. Actions do." The old orphanage director had always possessed an uncanny ability to cut through pretense. Anthony's hand hovered over the phone receiver. What right did he have to disrupt David's life after all these years? Yet as he watched Elliot in the garden below his window, carefully tending to the flowers Sarah had once described as her son's favorite, he recognized a truth he had been avoiding. The pain of potential rejection couldn't possibly exceed the agony of perpetual separation. With trembling fingers, he retrieved David's number from his address book, an entry he had updated religiously through private investigators. Over the years, though, he'd never found the courage to use it. Each digit he dialed felt like another step across a precarious bridge, one that could either lead to reconciliation or collapse under the weight of decades of silence. The ringing tone seemed to stretch into eternity. Anthony's heart pounded against his ribs, and he found himself holding his breath. What would he say if she answered? How could mere words bridge such a vast expanse of lost time? Through the window, he could see Elliot looking up at the clouds, probably searching for shapes as children do. The boy's resilience in the face of separation from his mother stood in stark contrast to Anthony's own cowardice. A click on the line, a moment of silence that contained universes of possibility. Then, a voice he hadn't heard in 23 years. "Hello?" Anthony's carefully prepared speech evaporated. The sophisticated actor, known for his commanding presence and articulate delivery, found himself speechless. In that moment, he wasn't Sir Anthony Hopkins, the celebrated performer. He was simply a father who had lost his way. "David?" His voice cracked on the single word, carrying within it decades of regret and longing. It's your father." Another silence followed, heavy with unspoken words and unexpressed emotions. Would she hang up? Would she unleash years of accumulated anger? Anthony gripped the edge of his desk, anchoring himself against the storm of possibilities. Through the receiver, he heard a sharp intake of breath. The next few moments would either begin to heal a quarter-century of hurt or confirm that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. As he waited for David's response, Anthony realized that regardless of the outcome, he had already crossed an important threshold, from the safety of inaction into the uncertain territory of hope. The weight of decades pressed against Anthony's chest as he stared at his phone, David's number glowing on the screen. His trembling finger hovered over the call button, each second stretching into an eternity. Behind him, Elliot's soft breathing, as he slept on the couch, provided an anchor to the present moment, reminding Anthony why he needed to make this call. The connection clicked, and the familiar sound of ringing filled his ear. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. With each tone, Anthony's heart threatened to burst from his chest. What if she didn't answer? What if she did? Which outcome terrified him more? "Hello?" David's voice, so similar to her mother's, cut through the static. Anthony's throat constricted, words failing him for perhaps the first time in his lengthy acting career. "Hello? Is someone there?" "David," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. It's your father." The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. Anthony could hear his daughter's measured breathing, imagining her standing in her kitchen, perhaps gripping the counter as he often did during difficult conversations. "Why are you calling?" The words weren't angry, but careful, measured, as if each one had been examined before being released into the world. "It's been 7 years, Dad." The title Dad hit Anthony like a physical blow. How long had it been since he'd heard that word from her lips? "I know," he responded, his voice steadying. "I know it has. I've been thinking about you, about everything." A soft shuffle came through the line, followed by the sound of a chair being pulled out. David was settling in for the conversation. A good sign, perhaps? "What brought this on?" she asked, her professional therapist's tone slipping into her voice, the same one she'd developed after years of helping others navigate their own family traumas. Anthony glanced at Elliot's sleeping form, the boy's presence giving him strength. "I've met someone," he began, then quickly added, "a child. He's lost his mother temporarily and I'm helping him. He's reminded me of so many things, David. Of the orphanage, of your mother, of you." "A child?" The professional distance in David's voice cracked slightly, revealing genuine curiosity. "You're helping a lost child?" "Yes. His name is Elliot. He's about 6 or 7, and he plays the piano." Anthony paused, memories flooding back. "Just like you used to." The mention of the piano created another moment of weighted silence. Anthony could almost see David's fingers moving unconsciously, muscle memory from years of practice still intact. "You always did love music," she finally said, her voice softer now. "I loved watching you play," Anthony corrected gently. "I loved seeing you create something beautiful. I was so proud, David. I still am." A sharp intake of breath came through the line. "Dad, you can't just call after 7 years and expect—" "I don't," Anthony interrupted, surprising himself with his certainty. "I don't expect anything. I needed you to know that I think about you, that I miss you, that I'm sorry for everything that happened after your mother died." The mention of her mother shifted the conversation's temperature. David's voice, when it came again, carried the weight of old pain. "You disappeared into your work. You left me alone when I needed you most." "I did," Anthony acknowledged, the admission burning his throat. "I couldn't face the emptiness she left behind. I couldn't bear to see her in your face, hear her in your music. But that was my weakness, David, not yours. Never yours." A muffled sound came through the line, something between a sob and a laugh. "Why now, Dad? Why this moment?" The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Anthony's study as his trembling hand held the phone. After decades of silence, hearing David's voice felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The conversation began tentatively, like two strangers finding their way through darkness, each word carefully chosen to avoid reopening old wounds. "I've been thinking about you," Anthony said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken years. "Meeting Elliot made me realize how much time we've lost." The silence on the other end of the line stretched until it nearly became unbearable, but Anthony waited, remembering Mr. Langley's advice about patience and understanding. David's response came softly. "Mom used to say you were better with other people's children than your own." The words could have been bitter, but instead carried a hint of weariness, of old pain worn smooth by time. "When I heard about what you did for that lost boy, Elliot, it reminded me of the story she told about your work at the orphanage. In another part of the city, Sarah held Elliot close as they sat at their piano, their reunion still fresh and precious. The boy's fingers danced across the keys, playing the melody Anthony had taught him during their brief time together. The bow music served as a bridge between their separation and reunion, healing the fears that had haunted both mother and child. Mr. Langley observed the changes in his old friend from a distance, noting how Anthony's experience with Elliot had cracked open a door long thought sealed. The orphanage director recognized the same transformation he'd witnessed countless times before, how children could mend broken adults in ways no others could. "I was afraid," Anthony admitted to David, the words emerging with surprising ease. "After your mother left, I threw myself into acting because pretending to be someone else was easier than facing my failures as a father." The confession hung between them, neither accusation nor excuse, simply truth. David's breath caught audibly. "I used to watch all your performances," she revealed. "Even when I was angriest, I never missed one. Sometimes I'd sit in the back of the theater and leave before the lights came up." The admission carried years of longing, of a daughter's love persisting despite the distance. The conversation flowed more freely then, like a river finding its natural course after years of obstruction. They spoke of David's life, her work as a teacher, her own struggles with connection. Anthony listened more than he spoke, storing each detail like precious gems, building a picture of the woman his daughter had become. Sarah had reached out to Anthony earlier that day, wanting to thank him properly for caring for Elliot. The boy had spoken of their time together with such joy, of music and stories and simple kindnesses that had made his frightening separation bearable. She recognized in Anthony's actions the same protective instinct that had driven her own frantic search. As the conversation with David drew to a close, Anthony found himself voicing a hope he'd barely allowed himself to consider. "Perhaps, if you're willing, we could meet. There's a young boy, and his mother I'd like you to meet." He paused, heart racing. "And I'd like to try being a father again if you'll let me." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and fear in equal measure. David's response, when it came, carried the same tentative hope that had characterized their entire conversation. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. "It's time we both stopped hiding." Mr. Langley, hearing of these developments later, smiled at how life had come full circle. The orphanage where Anthony had once volunteered, seeking to fill an emptiness he couldn't name, had ultimately led him back to his own child through another lost one. The old director understood better than most how healing often came through unexpected channels, how love could find its way home through the most winding paths. The story of Anthony and Elliot's brief encounter had rippled outward, touching and transforming all it reached. Sarah and Elliot's bond grew stronger through their separation and reunion. Anthony and David found their way back to each other through the example of that same love. And somewhere in between, the music that had once filled an empty house with hope continued to play, a melody of new beginnings and second chances. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.